Petulant and vicious, Richard II is best remembered for the peasants' revolt which he faced up to when he was just 14 years of age in 1381. Although he came out of that with due credit, it did nothing for his future prospects as king. If anything, the successful conclusion of the peasants' revolt added nothing but pure egotism to his character and a lofty, insufferable personality. Born in Bordeaux in 1367, Richard was the son of Joan of Kent and the formidable Edward the Black Prince. Richard was following in some serious footsteps. His father, Edward, is widely regarded as one of the greatest knights in European history, first making his name at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where he was just 16. Richard's grandfather, King Edward III, had started what was to become known as the 100 Years' War, and he won great victories at Crécy and Poitiers, as well as some significant naval victories. His long reign had tailed off in the last decade of his life as personal losses and ill health took their toll on the old king, and Edward III eventually died of a stroke in 1377. One of the losses suffered in his last years was the death of his son and heir, the Black Prince, who had died a year earlier in 1376. A long military career had worn down the prince, and like his father, his last years were dominated by poor health. As the eldest son of the heir to the king, Richard became King of England on the death of his grandfather at the age of 10 in 1377. It wasn't long before he was faced with enormous challenges. The landscape for the poorer people in England had changed dramatically in the previous 30 years. After roughly a third of the population was wiped out by the Black Death in 1349, labourers found they were in demand as they were now less readily available, and accordingly their wages began to increase. In a bid to stop further inflation of peasants' wages, a cap was introduced. In another move to infuriate the poorer classes, a poll tax was levied. And so by 1381 there was a combustible situation in England, and it exploded in the middle of summer of 1381. Angry at the poll tax, the men of Essex, Kent, and other surrounding areas marched on London. The protests were not restricted to just the southeast of England. There were also protests taking place as far north as Yorkshire. The city of London exploded in a great fire of rage and destruction. One of the main targets of the peasants' wrath was John of Gaunt, the uncle of Richard II, the wealthiest and most powerful nobleman in the kingdom. Gaunt was far up north on campaign when the revolt started, which was lucky for him. But he didn't escape altogether unscathed. His palace at Savoy was destroyed. There were acts of vicious, unjustifiable cruelty carried out in the midst of the revolt. Some 30 or so weavers from Flanders were taken and beheaded at Cheapside for supposedly stealing jobs from English workers. As the revolt raged on, the king was holed up at the Tower of London as he watched his capital go up in flames. But soon enough, even the king's life was in jeopardy, as the mob found their way to the tower and, despite resistance, forced their way in. The Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury was found praying in a chapel. He was dragged out and his head was hacked off. His head can now be found stored in a safe at Canterbury Cathedral. Robert Hales, the treasurer, also went the same way as Sudbury. There was a lucky escape for Henry Bonningbrook, a cousin of the same age as the king and son of the hated John of Gaunt. Henry only had his life spared by the quick thinking and persuasive skills of a soldier who was guarding the tower. This was quite a fateful moment, as he went on to become Henry IV 18 years later, after he had deposed Richard II. Throughout the revolt, the rebels had proclaimed that they had no intention of harming the king, and instead wanted to meet him to tell him their demands. They had their wish granted, but after a short skirmish, one of the leaders, Wat Tyler, was cut down by the Mayor of London and soon finished off by the king's soldiers. In order to calm the situation, Richard spoke to the remaining rebels and granted, before soon revoking, their demands. For a 14-year-old boy to speak to a baying mob who had brutally murdered members of his government and set his capital aflame, he had demonstrated tremendous courage. Seeing this, his citizens must have thought they had a king in the same mould as his grandfather, Edward III. However, this wasn't to be. For a start, despite advice to the contrary, Richard had no intention of continuing the war that Edward III had started, and if anything, the tide was turning towards a possible French invasion of England. As with earlier kings, Richard had made himself unpopular by having favourites, and one of these was Michael de la Pole, who had negotiated a marriage for Richard to Anne of Bohemia, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. When she died in 1394, Richard was tremendously upset and tore down the palace where she had died. At her funeral, Richard launched a furious outburst after a nobleman was late to the funeral. Although he had loved his wife, the marriage was neither popular nor politically savvy, as heavy finances was given to the emperor, but of no clear benefit to England. The marriage was also childless, leaving Richard vulnerable. In 1387, de la Pole was forcibly removed from office, much to Richard's indignation. However, things were to get worse after a group of noblemen, known as the Lords Appellant, which included Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, faced down the king at Radcot Bridge, defeated him in battle, and condemned several of Richard's advisers to death in the merciless Parliament. Although peace did return, Richard never forgot this attack on his royal dignity, and in 1397, at Coventry, he served out revenge to two members of the Lords Appellant, Henry Bolingbroke and one Thomas Mowbray. The two had been in dispute when the king ordered them to solve their differences by a joust. Just before it took place, Richard dramatically intervened and sent both into exile. There had been other persecutions of the Lords Appellant, with the Earls of Arundel executed and Warwick sentenced to life in prison, with Gloucester dying in mysterious circumstances. Richard had shown himself to be a vindictive man whose actions would soon come back to haunt him. In 1399, whether it was through arrogance, ignorance of his ever-growing unpopularity, or just plain stupidity, Richard set sail for Ireland. His uncle John of Gaunt had died that year, and instead of allowing the Duchy of Lancaster to go to the rightful heir, Henry Bonningbrook, Richard had taken it for himself. To do that and then leave the realm is an act of total and utter madness, and Richard paid the price. Bolingbroke returned from exile and landed with a force at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, with the initial intention of claiming what was due to him. However, it soon became clear to Henry that Richard was highly unpopular, and there was a growing support for Henry to claim the throne of England. By the time Richard had heard the news and had decided to hurry back and halt Henry's march to power, the game was up for Richard. Richard's only support base was in Cheshire, and he was eventually captured, floundering hopelessly in Wales. He was taken to the Tower of London, formally deposed, before he was moved to Pontefract Castle. The following year, in 1400, Richard was starved to death. Initially, he was buried in Hertfordshire, before being moved to Westminster Abbey by Henry IV's son, Henry V, who had been fond of Richard growing up. So, in summary, Richard's reign had started off with exceptional promise, but his lack of military pedigree, his capability for greed and revenge, and his overbearing sense of royal entitlement had been his undoing. His expedition to Ireland serves as one of the most ridiculous acts ever carried out by a medieval monarch, demonstrating a complete lack of intelligence. One enemy he had made a long time before his eventual deposition, Henry Bolingbroke, his own cousin, brought him crashing down, although Richard ultimately has nobody to blame but himself.